There was never just one moment that created the darkness you see in someone like this. People love simple stories because simple stories make them comfortable. They want to point at one bad day, one betrayal, one rejection, one painful memory and say, that's where everything changed. But human beings are rarely that convenient. Sometimes the transformation happens quietly. One disappointment at a time, one broken promise after another. One moment where you realize the world doesn't always reward kindness, honesty, or innocence. You laugh, you keep moving, you pretend it doesn't matter. Until one day you realize you've become someone completely different from the person who started the journey. But here's the uncomfortable part. Pain doesn't automatically make you powerful. Sometimes it makes you bitter. Sometimes it makes you cruel. Sometimes it convinces you that nothing matters because caring became too expensive. The real battle is deciding what you're going to do with everything that happened to you. You can let the darkness define you, or you can stare directly at it and understand where it came from. You can recognize the anger without worshiping it, recognize the wounds without letting them become your identity, and recognize the chaos without becoming its servant. That's where the real story begins. Not with a costume, a laugh, or some dramatic moment, but with a human being trying to make sense of a world that stopped making sense to them. While every disappointment leaves another mark, every betrayal changes another expectation, and every unanswered question creates another reason to wonder whether becoming cold is easier than remaining human. Because sometimes the person everyone fears is simply the person nobody bothered to understand before the damage became visible. And sometimes the most important question isn't what happened to them, but what choices were made after everything happened. When there was still a chance to become something different, something stronger without becoming cruel, something wiser without becoming empty, something powerful without losing the last piece of humanity that survived the chaos. Pain rarely arrives with a warning sign. It doesn't knock on the door and announce that it's about to change you. Sometimes it begins with something small, a rejection that seemed harmless, a friend who suddenly disappears, a promise that gets broken, a moment when you needed someone and discovered they weren't there. And you tell yourself it's fine, because what else are you supposed to say? Then another disappointment arrives. Then another. You laugh it off, because people are more comfortable with your smile than your suffering. You become good at saying, I'm okay, even when you're not, and eventually everyone believes you. That's the dangerous part. Not the pain itself, but the silence surrounding it. When someone keeps swallowing disappointment without processing it, the emotions don't magically disappear. They wait. They collect. They change the way that person interprets everything around them. A neutral comment starts sounding like an insult. A delayed response feels like rejection. Someone walking away feels like proof that nobody stays. The mind begins building defenses because it doesn't want to be hurt the same way twice. You stop trusting easily. You stop expecting kindness. You start watching people more carefully, searching for the moment when they're going to disappoint you. And suddenly you're not experiencing the present anymore. You're defending yourself against the past. That's how pain can reshape a personality without anyone noticing the transformation happening. The person who once wanted connection may start pretending they don't need anybody. The person who once believed in people may start laughing at the idea of trust. The person who once cared deeply may begin acting like nothing matters, and everyone around them sees the behavior, but not the history behind it. They see anger and call it attitude. They see distance and call it arrogance. They see silence and call it weakness. They see an unusual reaction and immediately decide they understand the person. Funny, isn't it? People often judge the explosion while ignoring the pressure that built before it. But here's where the story becomes more complicated, because pain can explain someone's behavior without excusing everything they choose to do. Being hurt doesn't give anyone permission to hurt innocent people. Suffering can influence your choices, but it doesn't remove responsibility for those choices. That's an uncomfortable truth, but an important one. You can acknowledge what happened to you without turning it into a license to destroy everything around you. You can admit that life treated you unfairly without deciding that unfairness must become your personality. The strongest response to pain isn't pretending it never happened. It's understanding it so deeply that it no longer controls every decision you make. You learn what triggers you. You recognize the patterns. You stop confusing protection with isolation. You stop believing that becoming cold is the only way to become strong. Real strength isn't the absence of pain. It's the ability to carry painful experiences without allowing them to dictate your character, your relationships, or your future, while slowly separating the person you are today from everything that happened to you yesterday, recognizing that wounds may explain where you came from without having the authority to decide where you go, and learning that the darkness inside your story can become something you understand rather than something you worship, because the moment you stop letting old pain automatically choose your reactions, you begin taking back the part of yourself that was buried underneath disappointment, anger, loneliness, and the constant expectation of being hurt again, leaving you with a choice that nobody else can make for you. Whether the pain becomes a prison that keeps repeating the past or a lesson that helps you build a different future, while every difficult memory becomes something you can examine without allowing it to become the entire definition of who you are, and every scar becomes evidence not that you are broken beyond repair, but that you survived something difficult and still have the ability to decide what kind of person stands beyond it, without needing to pretend the suffering was meaningless or pretend that everything suddenly became beautiful. Simply recognizing that pain may have written part of your story, but it doesn't have to hold the pen forever. Imagine what happens when someone keeps speaking and nobody listens. At first, they try to explain themselves. They tell you what hurts. They tell you what they're afraid of. They ask for understanding, maybe even quietly, because they don't want to become a burden. But when every attempt gets ignored, something begins to change. You stop asking. You stop explaining. You stop expecting anyone to care. And that's where the real danger begins, because a person who feels unheard for long enough may eventually decide that being understood doesn't matter anymore. They begin communicating through distance, sarcasm, anger, silence, or behavior that makes everyone suddenly pay attention, and then everybody looks shocked, asking, "What happened to you? What happened?" That's the funny question. Where were you when the person was still trying to tell you? Where were you when the pain was quiet enough to ignore? People often notice someone's breakdown long after they've ignored the 1,000 small moments that came before it. They notice the anger because anger is loud. They notice the withdrawal because silence suddenly makes them uncomfortable. They notice the change because the person who used to tolerate everything finally stops tolerating it. But they don't always notice the years of disappointment underneath it. Maybe that person kept showing up for everyone else while nobody showed up for them. Maybe they were constantly told to toughen up when what they really needed was someone willing to listen. Maybe every vulnerable moment was dismissed as weakness. Every complaint was treated like drama, and every attempt to communicate was turned into an argument. Eventually, they learn a terrible lesson. If nobody listens when you speak softly, maybe you have to become louder. But becoming louder isn't always becoming stronger. Sometimes it's simply a sign that something inside has been ignored for too long. That's why listening matters. Not just hearing words, but actually paying attention to what someone is trying to communicate. And this applies to yourself too. You can become the person who ignores your own warning signs. You tell yourself you're fine because admitting you're exhausted would mean changing something. You laugh because crying would make the situation real. You stay in unhealthy environments because leaving feels inconvenient. You keep accepting disrespect because you've convinced yourself that asking for better treatment is somehow selfish. Then one day your patience disappears, and you wonder why you suddenly feel like a completely different person. You weren't suddenly different. You were accumulating everything you refused to address. But here's where responsibility enters the story. Being ignored can explain anger, but it doesn't justify destroying other people. Pain deserves understanding, but it doesn't deserve a blank check. You can acknowledge that nobody listened to you without deciding that nobody else deserves to be heard. You can recognize your wounds without turning them into weapons. That's where maturity begins. You learn to communicate before resentment becomes an identity. You learn to walk away before bitterness becomes your personality. You learn to ask for help before everything becomes unbearable. You learn that being strong doesn't mean suffering silently until you explode while the people around you suddenly realize that the person they thought was quiet, patient, and easygoing had been carrying far more than they ever totes. And instead of allowing that realization to turn you into someone consumed by anger, you begin using it as a reason to understand yourself more honestly, recognize your limits, speak clearly, establish boundaries, and stop waiting for people who repeatedly prove that they aren't willing to listen. Because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do isn't screaming louder. It's finally refusing to remain somewhere your voice is constantly treated like background noise. While you learn to recognize the difference between being misunderstood and being deliberately disrespected, between needing patience and needing distance, between giving someone another chance and giving them another opportunity to hurt you, and between carrying your pain with dignity and carrying it like a weapon, choosing to become someone who listens to their own needs before resentment has to scream them into existence. While the world continues doing what it always does, some people listening, some people judging, some people misunderstanding, and some people simply not caring, leaving you with the responsibility of deciding what you will do with your voice, your boundaries, your pain, and the parts of yourself you once believed nobody would ever understand, without allowing the silence of others to become the silence inside you. Suffering can either consume you or become the raw material you use to build strength. And that's the part nobody likes to admit because it sounds much easier when we pretend pain automatically makes people stronger. It doesn't. Sometimes pain makes people bitter, suspicious, exhausted, or completely disconnected from themselves. Pain doesn't choose your destination, you do. The same experience that destroys one person can become a lesson for another, not because the suffering was somehow good, but because the person decided to learn from it instead of allowing it to become the only thing they could see. Think about what happens after disappointment. You lose something important, and suddenly your mind wants an explanation. Why me? Why did they do that? Why wasn't I enough? Why did everything change? Those questions can keep you trapped because they're focused on finding a perfect explanation for something that may never have one. Eventually, you have to ask a different question. What am I going to do with what happened? That's where power begins. You can't always choose what happened to you, but you can influence what happens next. Maybe someone betrayed your trust. You can become suspicious of everyone, or you can become wiser about who earns your trust. Maybe you experienced rejection. You can spend years trying to prove your value, or you can build a life where your value doesn't depend on one person's approval. Maybe you failed publicly. You can hide forever, or you can learn how to handle embarrassment without letting it control your future. Maybe someone treated you unfairly. You can spend the rest of your life trying to make them suffer, or you can refuse to let their behavior determine the person you become. None of those choices erase the pain. They simply stop the pain from owning the future. And don't confuse strength with pretending you're unaffected. That's another performance. Real strength allows you to admit that something hurt. You can cry. You can be disappointed. You can need time. You can ask for help. You can step away from people who make your life unhealthy. Strength doesn't require you to walk around pretending you're made of stone. It requires you to remain responsible for what you do with your emotions. Anger can become information instead of destruction. Fear can become awareness instead of paralysis. Sadness can become a reminder that something mattered. Disappointment can become a lesson about expectations. Even loneliness can teach you the difference between being alone and being surrounded by people who don't understand you. That's how suffering becomes useful without pretending it was necessary. You extract the lesson, then you keep moving, and sometimes the most powerful transformation happens quietly. Nobody sees the nights you spend rebuilding your confidence. Nobody sees the moments when you choose not to send the message. Nobody sees when you stop checking for approval, stop chasing explanations, or stop returning to situations that repeatedly hurt you. They only notice the final version and wonder where that strength came from, while you know it came from every small decision you made when you could have returned to the same patterns, but chose something different. Every time you turned pain into awareness, disappointment into boundaries, rejection into independence, and fear into careful action, slowly creating a version of yourself that doesn't need the past to disappear before moving forward. Because healing isn't about making the painful experience beautiful. It's about refusing to let something painful become the permanent author of your life. And once you understand that, you stop asking whether the suffering was worth it and start asking what wisdom you're going to carry forward, what habits you're going to change, what boundaries you're going to strengthen, what people you're going to trust differently, and what future you're going to build with the information you gained, while the memory remains part of your story, without becoming the entire story, leaving you stronger, not because pain magically improved you, but because you decided to respond to it with awareness instead of surrender, discipline instead of destruction, and growth instead of becoming trapped inside the same wound forever. While every difficult chapter becomes another place where you learn what you're capable of surviving, what you're no longer willing to tolerate, and what kind of person you want to become when the world gives you another reason to become someone you don't recognize, choosing to take the lesson without carrying every piece of the pain, choosing to remember without reliving, choosing to protect yourself without closing yourself completely, and choosing to move forward without needing the past to apologize before you allow yourself to live again. Because the moment suffering stops being your identity and becomes information, it loses some of its power, and you gain the freedom to decide what comes next, without pretending that what happened never mattered, simply refusing to let it be the final word on who you are becoming. There comes a moment when anger stops feeling like an emotion and starts feeling like an identity. When you have carried disappointment for so long that you forget what you were like before you started expecting the worst from everyone. At first, the darkness feels useful. It protects you. If you don't care, nobody can disappoint you. If you expect betrayal, you won't be surprised when someone leaves. If you stay emotionally distant, nobody gets close enough to hurt you. Sounds clever, doesn't it? Almost like you've discovered the perfect armor. But armor has a funny little problem. The longer you wear it, the harder it becomes to remember how to take it off. You begin confusing protection with isolation. You call bitterness realism. You call distrust intelligence. You call emotional numbness strength. And eventually you start pushing away the very things you once wanted, not because you stopped needing them, but because needing them reminds you that you can still be hurt. That's how a person can slowly lose themselves without noticing. The angry version of you starts making decisions that the wounded version never would have made. You stop asking whether something is right and start asking whether it makes you feel powerful. You stop looking for understanding and start looking for opportunities to make someone else feel what you felt. But here's the trap. Revenge can make you feel powerful for a moment, while quietly turning you into a prisoner of the person who hurt you. If every decision you make is designed to prove them wrong, punish them, embarrass them, or make them regret losing you, then they're still controlling your life from a distance. That's not freedom. That's another kind of attachment. Real power begins when you can acknowledge the anger without allowing it to become your personality. You can remember what happened without making every new person pay for what someone else did. You can become cautious without becoming cruel. You can set boundaries without building walls around your entire existence. And you can admit that you were hurt without being ashamed of it. The goal isn't to become the person who never feels anything. That's not strength. That's simply another form of escape. The goal is to feel everything and still choose your actions deliberately. When anger rises, pause. When suspicion appears, look for evidence. When someone disappoints you, decide whether the lesson is about them, about you, or about the boundary you failed to establish. When loneliness appears, don't automatically return to people who repeatedly damaged your peace just because familiar pain feels safer than unfamiliar growth. You are allowed to outgrow versions of yourself that were created during survival. You are allowed to become softer without becoming weak, stronger without becoming cruel, and wiser without becoming cynical. Because darkness may explain how you changed, but it doesn't have to decide where you go next. And the moment you realize that you are more than the anger you carried, more than the betrayal you survived, more than the rejection that wounded your confidence, and more than the mistakes you made while trying to protect yourself, you begin taking pieces of yourself back, slowly removing the armor that once kept you safe, but now keeps everything meaningful outside, learning to recognize when protection has become imprisonment, when independence has become isolation, and when strength has become another word for refusing to feel, while choosing to rebuild instead of remaining trapped inside the version of yourself that was created by pain, allowing the darkness to become something you understand rather than something you obey. Because you don't have to become heartless, just because someone once treated your heart carelessly, and you don't have to spend your future proving that the person who hurt you was wrong. You can simply become someone they no longer have the power to define. Someone who remembers the lesson without living inside the wound. Someone who can walk through difficult moments without turning every scar into a weapon. And someone who finally understands that the strongest escape from darkness isn't pretending it never existed, but refusing to let it become the only place you know how to live understanding before judging. Is difficult because judgment is fast, convenient, and emotionally satisfying, while understanding requires patience, context, and the uncomfortable possibility that your first impression might be completely wrong. Someone does something strange, and people immediately decide they know why. Someone becomes quiet, and suddenly they're arrogant. Someone becomes angry, and suddenly they're dangerous. Someone withdraws, and everyone assumes they don't care. Funny how quickly people can write an entire biography from one moment. But human beings aren't single moments. They're collections of experiences, fears, choices, mistakes, memories, and circumstances that nobody else can fully see. That doesn't mean every harmful action should be excused. Understanding someone isn't the same as approving of everything they do. You can recognize that a person has been hurt while still holding them responsible for the damage they cause. You can understand someone's anger without allowing them to use it against you. You can acknowledge someone's difficult past without pretending their choices don't matter. That's where real maturity begins. Instead of asking only, "What's wrong with this person?" sometimes ask, "What happened that might have shaped this behavior?" Maybe the answer changes your perspective. Maybe it doesn't. Either way, you've replaced an automatic judgment with curiosity. And curiosity is powerful because it slows the mind down enough to see details that anger usually hides. Think about the people you've misunderstood in your own life. Maybe you thought someone was ignoring you when they were actually overwhelmed. Maybe you thought someone was arrogant when they were protecting themselves. Maybe you thought someone didn't care because they didn't know how to express what they felt. Maybe you assumed someone's confidence meant they had never struggled, when in reality they had spent years rebuilding themselves. You didn't have all the information. None of us do. That's why humility matters. You don't have to pretend you understand everyone's story. You simply have to remember that you probably don't know the whole thing. And when it comes to people who have done something wrong, understanding can actually make your response smarter. If you know what motivates a behavior, you may recognize the boundary you need to establish. If someone repeatedly manipulates you, understanding their pattern doesn't mean staying close to them. It means you can protect yourself without wasting energy trying to destroy them. If someone is struggling emotionally, compassion doesn't require you to become their therapist or sacrifice your own safety. You can care while maintaining boundaries. You can offer support while recognizing your limits. You can walk away without turning the person into a monster in your mind. Because once you reduce every difficult person to a villain, you make it harder to learn from the situation. You only see enemies. You stop seeing patterns. And when you stop seeing patterns, you become more likely to repeat the same mistakes with different people. Understanding gives you information. Judgment gives you a label. Information is usually more useful. This doesn't mean becoming naive. Trust should still be earned. Boundaries should still exist. Serious harm should still have consequences. But you don't need hatred to protect yourself. You don't need contempt to walk away. You don't need revenge to prove that you were hurt. While you learn to look beneath behavior without becoming blind to its consequences, recognizing that every person carries a story you may never fully know, including the person you see in the mirror, and that your own worst moments were probably more complicated than the version someone else could describe in a single sentence, because human beings are messy, contradictory, wounded, ambitious, frightened, hopeful, and capable of making terrible choices while still containing the possibility of change. And understanding that complexity doesn't make you weak. It makes your judgment more accurate, your boundaries more intelligent, and your response more deliberate, allowing you to separate compassion from permission, empathy from trust, and understanding from surrender, while refusing to let someone else's pain become an excuse for harming you, and refusing to let your own pain become an excuse for harming them. Because the real strength is being able to look at the darkness in another person without immediately pretending you have no darkness of your own, choosing instead to understand what you can, protect yourself where necessary, and judge actions without pretending you know every reason behind them, while becoming more careful about the stories you tell yourself about other people. Because sometimes the person you thought was simply cruel was carrying something you never saw. Sometimes the person you thought was weak was surviving something enormous. And sometimes the person you thought you understood completely was simply a stranger whose story you had filled in with your own assumptions, leaving you with the humility to look again, listen longer, and recognize that understanding doesn't require you to agree with someone. It simply requires enough awareness to remember that every visible behavior has an invisible context, and every person is more complicated than the version of them that appears in a rumor, an argument, a single mistake, or one painful moment. While you continue learning to see people clearly without surrendering your judgment, your boundaries, or your sense of responsibility, choosing to understand before judging, because once you learn to look beneath the surface, you stop reacting only to what people show you and start recognizing the deeper patterns that actually explain what you're seeing, without needing to excuse what is wrong or romanticize what is painful. Simply refusing to mistake a single chapter for the entire story.